Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Today we come to the last line from the Lord's Prayer. The bit that begins, "For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory," was not part of the prayer that Jesus taught, but rather a response of praise that we added some time later. So we come to the last line, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. That was how St. Augustine prayed in his Confessions. Augustine was my kind of saint. He loved God, but he also knew how to live a bit. He was very human, and it took him a while to work out whether he really wanted to avoid temptation. And I confess that I feel a certain inner reluctance as I pray this line from the Lord's Prayer. I definitely resonate with Augustine's prayer. Lord, preserve me from gluttony, but not yet. Temptation is one of those things that we're taught to think of as bad, but which in some cases we do think is rather fun. Pope Francis recently attracted a certain amount of attention by suggesting that this line was wrongly translated in any event because God doesn't tempt anyone. And there he put his finger on the complications of language and concept that make this line rather fiddly. The word temptation, as it appears here, translates a Greek verb peirazo, which could be translated as either tempt or test. And to make it even more complicated, that verb is interchangeable in Greek with another Greek verb, dokimazo, which also appears in the New Testament, which means to prove. There are indeed some versions of the Lord's Prayer that translate this line as "lead us not into the time of trial," referring to that idea of testing and proving. Our troubles with the Bible, in fact, often stem from the fact that both Greek and Hebrew in which the Bible was written carry double meanings that can get lost in translation and thereby become far too one-dimensional when we translate them into English. So both of the ideas conveyed by the original Greek need to be held in view if we're to understand what we're asking God for in this prayer. Jesus, of course, was famously tempted by the devil in the wilderness. And Matthew describes the devil as the tempter, the one who leads us into sin. And in Luke chapter 22, verse 28, Jesus describes the whole of his ministry as one great long trial or temptation. He is tempted, for example, by the Pharisees who want to entangle him in his own words, and by the devil who wants to bring him into his power and bring Jesus' power over to the dark side. Seen against Jesus' example, temptation is what leads us into a life of sin, which is to become entangled and snared. It is the road back to slavery in Egypt, from which we cannot free ourselves. It is a path of thorns that looks enticing at the entrance, but when we are in it, we find there is no way back, and the more we struggle, the more it hurts, and the more trapped we become. This path imagery, evoked by Jesus' use of the phrase, "lead us not into temptation," conjures up memory of the 23rd Psalm. He leads me in the paths of righteousness. He leads me by still waters and into green pastures. Jesus, with the Good Shepherd metaphor always at the forefront of his own self-understanding, seems to have had that psalm constantly in view. It's the background music to the whole of the gospel, and it's surely what we are meant to envisage as we pray this line. It is a prayer that God will shepherd us in his paths. It never contemplates that God would lead us in the path of temptation, but rather it uses a classic Jewish turn of phrase that sets up a clear distinction for us to see. Not this, but that. Lead us not down the broad path that leads to destruction, but rather pluck us from that path and lead us down your path instead, Lord. It reminds us that God is not like the bad shepherds who just leave us to wander down the broad path following our own stomachs, but is the good shepherd who leads us away from harm so that we need never fear any evil. And that brings in the second resonance we are meant to hear in this part of the prayer, the idea of testing or proving. It is to say, lead me not into judgment. Do not put me on trial on the basis of my sins or weaknesses or failings, for I am too easily tempted. But rather judge me by the fact that the shepherd has delivered me from evil. and now I belong to the Good Shepherd. It is to say, as John Wesley put it, I am no longer my own, but yours. So guide me in your paths. Let me fear no evil. Count me among your flock. And of course, to be counted among God's flock is also, paradoxically, to be sent out to help bring in other lost sheep. And that brings me back to Augustine's prayer that I mentioned at the beginning. Because although it was a very honest and open acknowledgement of Augustine's own inner struggle and ambivalence about temptation, it also pointed to his realization that the Christian faith was about more than just avoiding evil. Just shutting ourselves away in a sealed holy bubble is not going to make us truly godly. Somehow, we have to go out into the world and engage with it like Jesus did, yet without sin. And perhaps on balance, Augustine thought, it is better to run the risk of sin in order to engage with the world in mission. You see, as soon as Jesus gathers us safely back into his flock, he sends us out again as sheep among wolves, to run the risk of temptation and failure in order to bring others back into the flock. That is part of what we're praying for this week. And to reach out, God does not keep us locked away safe in the sheepfold, but rather leads us on a journey where we will encounter other paths that will appear tempting. We cannot engage with the world without encountering those paths. So to pray this line is to say, Lord, today I'm going out into the world again. I'm going to be tempted. I'm going to find that hard. I am not strong enough to do this in my own strength. I need you to help lead me, not in those paths, but in your path. So as I run that risk in order to serve you again today, let me not be afraid of evil, but lead me in your paths and deliver me from the other path, so that we might all be brought back into your flock where there is rejoicing in heaven. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.